business cycle, macroeconomists have generally focused on the gap between conventional unemployment rate, that is the incidence of people who are out of work and actively searching for a job, and the natural rate of unemployment judged to be consistent with balanced growth path, in wake of a severe recession and sluggish recovery. We call it a depression. However, the conventional unemployment gap can be relatively poor or even misleading indicator of labor market slack. In particular, the assessment of the shortfall of employment from the balanced growth pattern incorporate the extent of hidden unemployment. That is, people who are not actively searching but to have rejoined the labor force if the market was stronger would have. Incidents of underemployment, that is, people working part-time who want full-time unemployment. This paper will begin to examine the evolution of the U.S. labor market slack over recent years and show that underemployment and hidden underemployment currently account for the bulk of the employment gap. Our benchmark assessment of current magnitude of the shortfall in U.S. employment includes the incidence of underemployment and hidden employment that is equivalent to about 3.3 million full-time jobs. More of uncertainty surrounds the assessment is clearly skewed to the upside, so that the actual shortfall in employment might well be twice as large. Now, from the Congressional Budget Office, analysis indicates that the potential labor force is currently expanding by 50 to 60,000 individuals per month due to demographic factors. Thus, if non-farm payroll continues to rise steadily by 260,000 jobs per month, which has been the average over the past few quarters. Now, it's fallen a little bit short of that. If the economy recovery decelerates and payroll growth slows to around 100,000 jobs, slightly above that, roughly similar to its pace during 2010 and 2011, then the unemployment gap would be barely diminished over the coming years. Recent data on nominal wage growth is fully consistent with our assessment that the labor market slack remains substantial, as shown. Well, we won't get into that because you can't see it. A 12-month change through February of 2015 was just 1.6%, down a full percentage point from the pace of wage growth last summer. Finally, we consider the monetary policy implications of labor market slack using a variant of the sample rule that has been extensively studied by Taylor and characterized as the balanced approach rule by Janet Yellen. I'm assuming it's Janet Yellen. The analysis indicates that just a second here. The initiation of monetary policy tightening would be premature at the present time. That has been an argument that is ongoing. Gauging the slack, this is called the employment gap. Our measure of employment gap is a sum of three specific components. First, the unemployment gap is derived from the conventional unemployment labeled U3 by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. From the professional forecasters' consensus projection is longer run normal rates, as reported by semi-annual blue chip survey. Secondly, the participation gap is derived in percentage points of the actual size of the labor market from the CBO assessment of potential labor force. This shortfall corresponds to the notion of hidden unemployment described above. And third, the underemployment gap takes the BLS's measure of people working part-time, expressed as a fraction of the potential labor market, as a deviation from its 1994 to 2007. And we're kind of skipping through this a bit, but the evolution of the full unemployment gap, the confidence bands around our current assessment of the employment gap may in fact be skewed to the upside, i.e. the assessment may well be underestimate the true magnitude of labor slack. The unemployment gap, the CBC again regularly produces assessments of the national unemployment rate that would prevail if the economy were in a balanced growth pattern. Now, this is one of the things that has happened here. Sources accept fluctuation in aggregate demand in wake of the depression, and we call it here. The CBC redefines its analysis to gauge the extent to which the natural rate has been affected via transitory or persistent structural factors. Thus, over a few years, the CBC has produced estimates of long-term natural rate, which solely reflects the influence of long-lasting structural factors. Big argument on that. Survey of professional forecasters generally did not collect information about these estimates of the natural rate of unemployment. However, forecasters routinely make long-run projections regarding the path to which the economy is expected to converge over time, and such projections essentially reflect the assessment of characteristics of balanced growth patterns, including the growth rate of potential output and the natural rate of unemployment. This has been around for a very, very long time. Over the past few years, the unemployment rate has declined steadily, and normal wage inflation has been subdued. And no doubt, in the Blue Chip long-run survey published in March of 2015, the consensus outlook for unemployment was 5.1%, while the bottom, the bottom quarterly has declined to 4.5%, and the top quantity projection now stands at 5.5%. Interestingly, that the consensus outlook is identical to the midpoint of the central tendency of FOC participants' long-run unemployment rate projections that were released in March of 2015. There, the assessment of their long-term natural rate published in January was a notch higher at 5.4. Seems reasonable to infer that the uncertainty surrounding these assessments is skewed to the downside. Indeed, unemployment declined further over the coming quarter, while wage inflation remains subdued. The participation gap, skip a little bit here with theirs, aggregate demand stalks in effect given detailed projections on the size and demographic composition of the population, mainly drawn from the Census Bureau. CBC's assessment of potential labor force conveys its analysis of how demographic and structural factors are likely to influence the evolution of the labor force participation over time. In the wake of the Depression, the U.S. Labor market actually decreased in size through 2011, thus resumed its moderate upward trajectory over the past few years. Needlessly, from 2.9 to 13, CBC had moderate revision to its assessment of potential labor force. Now, in contrast, the CBC has recently made substantial downward revisions of its assessment of post-2008 trajectory for the potential labor force. CBC has concluded that the cyclical decline in labor force participation has become irreversible, i.e., now anticipates only 2/3 of the individuals who departed from the labor force in wake of the Depression will rejoin the labor force as the economy strengthens. And that is about right. And we're going to skip on here so we can get to that. Gauging the unemployment gap seems relatively straightforward by comparison with the challenges of assessing the unemployment gap and the participation rate. You won't get into too much of that. We'll come back to this again. We now move to examine the extent to which measures of labor market slack over and above the unemployment rate impact wedge. We follow the approach taken. This is Blanchflower and Oswald using data merged over of ongoing rotation group anyway, and current population surveys. Let's move on. The second part, called underemployment, provides new results as shown, and you can't see the columns here. We now incorporate the underemployment rate, which is defined as the number of workers who say they are working part-time for economic reasons. You hear that banted about quite a bit at various meetings. The wedge curve here, we now move on to examine the curve. The following approach is taken by Blanchflower using data here, data available from 1990 to 2012 from 50 states. And we'll get back to Blanchflower again. More would seem likely of structural factors. The primary reason why incidents of underemployment have declined gradually over a few years. After all, if the economy were in balanced growth pattern, and some employers preferred to shift their workforce towards a greater number of part-time workers, then those employers would need to offer relatively higher wages. Well, no doubt about that. In light of these considerations, it is striking that the underemployment rate has moved about half back from its peak in 2009. The wage, we move on to examine the extent to which the measures of labor market slack over and above the unemployment rate impact wages here. Now, we don't have time to look at the graphics. And monetary policy. No macroeconomic model provides a completely satisfactory description of any economy in the real world. Indeed, the limitations of existing macroeconomic models have been underscored by incidents of relatively large and persistent forecast errors. We've talked about that. Thus, rather than relying on monetary policy implications of any single macro model, it seems sensible to consider simple reference rules that to provide reasonable performance across plausible models. Such rules serve there, following the semi-annual analysis of Taylor. A simple rule of thumb for adjusting the level of the federal fund rate can be expressed as a weighted sum of four components: the equilibrium of real interest rates, the actual inflation rate, and the inflation gap, that is the variation of inflation from the central bank's inflation objective, and the level of resource slack. We discussed each component. The equilibrium interest rate is defined as short-term rate which the economy involves along as a balanced growth pattern. Inflation and inflation gap. The FOC establishes an objective of 2% there. We need not spend any more time on that. Resource slack. In light of ongoing analysis, we measure resource slack in terms of the total employment gap. In addition to benchmark estimates, we consider implications of several alternative assessments of labor and of labor market